Sammy was constantly moving, puffing, gasping for breath.
These behaviors were beyond my control.
He stopped walking entirely. All he did was hop.
I literally looked like a monster.
I was very nervous that her breakouts were contagious.
Next, two medical mysteries that defied the experts. When Beth Maloney's 12-year-old son, Sammy, refuses to sleep in his bed, his mother doesn't think much of it. Little does she realize his defiant behavior is just the beginning of a terrifying and rapid mental decline.
I had tried every single thing I could do to help him. I had completely lost my child.
Then, when Lynda Fox suddenly develops a disturbing skin condition, she's forced to face a bizarre disease that could kill her at any given moment.
I felt like somebody was suffocating me with a pillow.
She was in distress.
I thought that I was going to die.
In the summer of 2002, attorney Beth Maloney and her 3 young sons were getting ready to move into their new home in Kennebunkport, Maine.
The new house was much larger than the home that we had been in. It enabled me to work out of my home and really be there for my children.
It was me, my younger brother James, my older brother Josh, and my mom.
I was very much a single parent. Their dad lived in California.
Not having their father around was tough on all the kids, but Beth worried most about her 12-year-old, Sammy.
Sammy was always sensitive. I was more concerned about moving him than the other children because he was so attached to this particular area where we lived. He just loved to spend hours wandering around down at the water. So I was a little worried about whether it would be good for him or not.
But moving day goes off without a hitch, except for one unsettling incident.
I was carrying a box from the house to the van, getting ready to move, and I saw that Sammy was in the yard, walking around with his eyes shut, and he held his hands in front of him as if he were blind. I asked, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm memorizing." And I thought he wanted to memorize the place that we had lived.
It never really registered in my mind as something weird. It seemed like it was almost beyond my control.
I knew that kids sometimes did things that seemed a little bit odd. I wasn't concerned.
And once the family settles into the new house, Sammy seems thrilled to have an even bigger room than before.
We all just immediately loved the house. Sammy was very excited.
But underneath that smile is a child who is far from happy. In fact, a few days after moving in, Sammy begins to experience strange fears he's never felt before.
I was afraid to sleep in my bed.
He would not sleep in the bed in his room. And I said, "Sammy, I want you to sleep in your room." He became incredibly upset with me and ran out of the room. I came down in the morning, he was on the couch. Then I became much more insistent that he sleep in his room. The next night, when I went in to check on him, he was asleep, but sitting up in a chair.
The biggest problem was that she put a particular blanket on my bed, which I really didn't want to touch. There were little yellow stripes along the blanket, which really bothered me. I don't know why.
He really never slept in his bed from the day we moved in. It seemed odd. Why did I suddenly have this child who wouldn't sleep in a bed? I was worried. I didn't know what was wrong. I thought it was an emotional type of reason. So I called a psychologist to schedule an appointment.
I don't remember too much of what we actually discussed. I know we had thought the problems had to do with anxiety.
He was very protective of Sammy in terms of not telling me what Sammy would say, but he felt that he was having an extreme reaction to the fact that we had moved. I assumed that things were going to improve within a matter of a couple of weeks.
But just a few days later, Sammy suddenly develops a bizarre new obsession.
He insisted that we have all the lights on in the house 24 hours a day.
I couldn't stand the dark. I just remember that the dark was bad.
When it was time to go to bed, I went to shut the lights off, and then he turned the light right back on. I turned them off again. He totally flipped out and started screaming, but there was no reason for this. Suddenly, after having this wonderfully sweet boy for all these years, I had a defiant child on my hands. He was seeing the psychologist once a week, so I called him. The psychologist's advice was to just be very tolerant, and his suggestion was that we wait.
Desperate to get a handle on Sammy's rebellious behavior, Beth does her best to follow doctor's orders. But over the next 3 weeks, she grows increasingly frightened as Sammy's problems seem to snowball.
He was wound up, he was pacing all the time, he was constantly moving, wriggling, huffing, puffing, gasping for breath. Then he was pelting repairmen with acorns. Then he was screaming at the squirrels. Every single day there was a new behavior that was added. I said to the psychologist, shouldn't we be more concerned? And he said, not if this isn't interfering with the home. And I said, well, of course it's interfering with the home. And the psychologist said to me, well, try not to focus on it. I was frustrated, but I felt that following the directions of the psychologist, that we would be able to correct the situation, and then he was going to be fine.
Determined to get Sammy under control, Beth forges ahead and tries to maintain a sense of normalcy at home. But when she has to drop her oldest son off at boarding school, an incident occurs that turns Beth's entire world upside down.
I had to drive Josh up the third week in August, and Sammy was crunched in the seat. He wouldn't use a seat belt. His fingers were cramped as if he was maybe playing a piano, and he was rocking back and forth in his seat. He wouldn't talk to me at all. We got Josh to school, and he needed help, of course, getting his things into his dorm room. So I said to Sammy and James, okay, you guys stay here. I'm going to help Josh. I come back out to the van. Sammy's gone. Look all around. I can't see him anywhere. So I'm running as fast as I can. I'm screaming Sammy's name as I go. My concern at that point, I knew that it would be so easy for him to be lost and not be able to be found.
Sammy! Sammy!
Over the last 2 months, Beth Maloney's 12-year-old son, Sammy, has undergone a frightening transformation. His behavior is becoming more and more bizarre. And while his psychologist believes it's a severe reaction to stress, his mother isn't so sure. On a family trip, her troubled son has suddenly run away.
Sammy!
I started looking behind houses, and I spotted a motion. And I could see that it was Sammy in a parking lot doing what looked to me like toy soldier movements.
In town, my mom found me. I don't really know how.
I jumped out of the car and grabbed him.
I tried to run away.
He started kicking. He was thrashing. He was screaming. Finally, I did manage to actually pull him into the van.
I have no idea how long I was out there before my mom found me. It was just something that in my mind I had to do. I'm not quite sure why I felt compelled.
Desperate for answers, Beth puts in an emergency call to the psychologist, who begins to wonder if Sammy needs specialized help and suggests that he see a psychiatrist.
When we went to the psychiatrist's office, Sammy was snorting, huffing, puffing, rubbing his feet, holding his ears, screaming at people to leave me alone.
These behaviors were almost beyond my control in a way. I can't really describe it.
The psychiatrist told me that Sammy had obsessive-compulsive disorder.
Obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD, is a psychiatric condition in which patients experience irrational thoughts and fears that lead to repetitive and compulsive behaviors.
The psychiatrist prescribed an SSRI, that's a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And the theory was that it would cause the chemical processes in Sammy's brain to slow down, and as a result, the compulsions would fade. And I thought, finally, we're in good hands and we're going to get to the bottom of this.
But when school begins a few weeks later, Sammy doesn't seem to be improving, and Beth is worried about how he'll cope.
The medicine didn't seem to help him, but the psychologist told me that was the best thing to do. So I advised the school that Sammy was under the care of a psychologist and a psychiatrist and had been diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder.
On a cool fall morning, Beth drops Sammy off for his first day of school. She has no clue that the worst is yet to come.
Any electrical outlet on a wall would just have projections coming out of it in my mind that I had to step over. They were more like lasers coming out of walls from those movies where someone's trying to steal a diamond or something like that.
If anyone interrupted him, he would have to go back to the beginning and start again. And he was bent over, close to the shape of an upside-down L.
I would walk hunched over to duck under invisible walls.
I got a phone call from the school saying I had to come get him right away.
Horrified, Beth checks back in with Sammy's doctors, who assure her that the meds will eventually kick in and that school is the best place for him. But as the months go by, there are absolutely no signs of improvement.
What the psychiatrist said to me was he has no ability to control these behaviors unless we could get the dosage correct. So his medicines were consistently being adjusted upwards. It never made any difference whatsoever. He generally stayed in school for about, at most, 2 hours, at which point they would call and tell me that I had to come and get him.
It was difficult for me to do anything, really. And, you know, no one really wants to hang out with someone who's just doing behaviors all the time.
To make matters worse, Sammy is continually developing new and increasingly weird compulsions.
We were being assaulted with new behaviors every single day. He would only eat at the table if his eyes were shut. He wouldn't touch anything at all. He wouldn't even touch forks, knives, spoons, door handles, faucets. He also stopped showering, stopped changing his clothes, stopped combing his hair. In December, I decided there was no point in continuing to try to get him to school. I was saying to the psychologist, I think we need to be more concerned. And the psychologist felt that we would be able to manage this.
As the winter drags on, Beth does her best to care for Sammy. She even tries to homeschool him, but most of the time, his obsessions make that just about impossible.
It didn't feel like it was my fault that I had to do these behaviors, but I felt really, really bad about all the problems I was causing.
I was just heartbroken for him. In order to really survive on a day-to-day basis, I had to really just disconnect myself from my emotions. It was becoming so dysfunctional and horrible in our home.
Beth is at her wit's end when Sammy takes a terrifying turn for the worse.
I can remember in the spring, sitting at the table, Sammy was sitting there going... Then he started with repetitive phrases. He said, nothing is nothing is nothing is nothing is nothing.
Nothing is nothing.
Then sometimes he would put those nothing is nothing is nothing.
Nothing is nothing.
And he'd be looking at us like this, like through slits of his eyes. At this point, I was insisting to the psychiatrist that it couldn't be only OCD. So then the psychiatrist said that perhaps what we're looking at is Tourette's.
Tourette's syndrome is a neurological disorder characterized by involuntary physical and verbal tics. The disease, which is lifelong once it sets in, first strikes patients in childhood or adolescence.
And he said that we would have to add a different medication. I went online, I reviewed all the behaviors that the literature said were consistent with a diagnosis of Tourette's, and it seemed that Sammy was, in fact, doing pretty much everything that they described.
But as spring turns into summer, Sammy's disturbing behaviors take over his life completely.
He wouldn't hold a conversation. He wouldn't sleep. He wouldn't eat. He stopped walking entirely. All he did was hop. He had complex motor tics where he would hold his ears and grunt and jump and gasp for breath all at the same time. It was the most horrible thing that I could imagine. I'd completely lost my child.
Despite her mounting anguish, Beth continues trying to communicate with Sammy. But nothing could have prepared her for the wrenching moment that finally brings everything to a head.
Sammy came downstairs. He wouldn't talk to me. He just handed me this note that I unfolded. And I was absolutely scared to death by what it said.
Over the last year, Beth Maloney has watched her son Sammy transform into someone she doesn't recognize. Despite medications and therapy for OCD and Tourette's, grotesque compulsions rule his life. And Beth isn't sure how much more she can take.
Sammy came downstairs. He wouldn't talk to me. He just handed me this note that I unfolded. And he had written the word help in all capital letters.
I didn't think anyone would be able to help me, but I wrote help anyway. It was the only thing I could do.
I called my mother. I was sobbing. I said, I'm going to have to find him a placement where he can live because I cannot help him. We hung up the phone. Within 2 minutes, the phone rang again. My mom said, you need to talk to this woman who works with me. I think she can help you. As a result of that conversation, I took Sammy to see Dr. Catherine Nicolaitis in New Jersey.
I saw Sammy in August of 2003. I got a complete history from Beth. His symptoms were at a crisis level.
Most significantly, Dr. Nicolaitis is intrigued by one clear fact of his case. Sammy hasn't responded to any of the medications he's been taking.
She tried to give him a physical exam, but he really wasn't able to tolerate much touching.
I had some thoughts in terms of a diagnosis. We needed to do some blood work.
They probably ran 10 different tests. I was scared to death. I believed in my heart that we were going to find the answer. The results of the blood work came back in 24 hours.
He was producing antibodies to a specific bacteria, streptococcus. And once we had the elevated blood results, that confirmed for us the diagnosis of PANDAS.
PANDAS, or Pediatric Autoimmune Neuropsychiatric Disorder associated with strep, is a rare autoimmune disorder in which antibodies attack the brain. In a healthy child, when streptococcus bacteria infect the body, the immune system produces antibodies that target and destroy the strep. But in children like Sammy, for some unknown reason, the antibodies brutally assault the brain, causing OCD and Tourette's-like symptoms.
We don't know why the antibodies do this. The antibodies think that it's attacking the strep, but it's actually attacking neurons in the brain. which are responsible for motor movement. The manifestations are tic-like manifestations and obsessive-compulsive symptoms.
Sammy never had a sore throat. Some people are asymptomatic for strep.
Amazingly, the irrational fears, the unnatural behaviors, and even the outlandish visions were all the direct result of one simple thing: strep antibodies wreaking havoc on his brain. And it's now clear why the medicine he was taking had no effect.
Serotonin reuptake inhibitors are used to treat obsessive-compulsive symptoms, not strep.
Any impact they might have had was counteracted by the strep antibodies that were continually bombarding his brain. In fact, if Sammy hadn't been diagnosed when he was, his bizarre behaviors would have continued to multiply and possibly caused irreversible damage.
There is a sentiment that if you do not interfere early enough, that there can be excessive damage to the brain.
The scariest thing is that I could have totally lost my son to something as simple as a strep infection.
The good news is that PANDAS is treatable. While drugs target the underlying strep, therapy can help Sammy unlearn his compulsive behaviors.
We introduced a mood stabilizer as well as antibiotic therapy so that you are not only aiming your treatment at strep, but that you are also using traditional treatments that address obsessive-compulsive behavior or tics.
But unfortunately, Dr. Nicolaitis can't give Beth any guarantees about whether Sammy will ever be his old self again.
Sammy had the worst case of obsessive-compulsive symptoms I had ever seen. There's no way to predict whether he would be able to return to school.
I did not think I was going to get better. I thought I was going to have those behaviors for life.
Beth Maloney has just learned that her son Sammy has PANDAS, an extremely rare disease that attacks the brain. For over a year, it's made his life a living nightmare, ruled by bizarre obsessions. Now, the 13-year-old is on antibiotics that should help rein in his strange behavior, but he may never fully recover.
I was worried about whether there might have been permanent brain damage. I wanted to finally have Sammy back.
The next several days are almost unbearable as Beth waits to see some sign of improvement.
I began to notice differences immediately.
When I first started to not do behaviors, it was kind of a wonderful feeling.
At the time, and as aggressively as we treated Sammy, we were able to halt this process so that there was not significant damage.
Gradually, over the winter, Sammy's behaviors disappear altogether, and eventually, he no longer needs treatment.
He spent the next 6 months making up all of the 6th and 7th grade curriculum so that he returned to 8th grade with his classmates right on time.
I don't really feel any sort of OCD or Tourette's type behaviors or compulsions anymore.
While Sammy is thrilled to be back to his old self, he must now face an undeniable truth. He will always be susceptible to the condition.
If he were to begin to experience behaviors, he would know these are his symptoms of a strep infection. He needs to go on antibiotics for a couple of weeks, in the same way that another person would go on for a sore throat.
Beth is grateful that Sammy survived the ordeal unscathed, and now she can't help but wonder why his psychologist and psychiatrist failed to recognize the seemingly obvious clues to her son's condition.
How could it never cross their mind that the root cause of his disorder could be an infection?
PANDAS is controversial because PANDAS has only been recognized in the last 20 years or so. I think there may be undiagnosed cases because traditionally we look for strep by a throat infection, not by a presentation of symptoms of OCD and tics.
Today, Sammy is 20 and living a full and completely normal life.
Sammy is dynamite. He had a successful year as a freshman at one of the top computer science schools in the country.
I'm incredibly grateful to my mom for never really giving up. I hope Dr. Nicolaitis understands how grateful I am to her. She really saved my life. I don't really look back at how I felt then or what I did back then. I just look forward. I'm just happy to be where I am.
While there was no denying that Beth Maloney's son was literally losing his mind, doctor after doctor dismissed Lynda Fox's disfiguring disease, even when it threatened to kill her. In the fall of 2006, 42-year-old high school teacher Lynda Fox and her husband Barry were celebrating almost 20 years together, and just as much in love as when they first met.
She's a wonderful person, and my greatest joy.
It was love at first sight. Barry was teaching math and I was teaching French. He's my best friend. I couldn't ask for a better life.
They have a great relationship. They're just a very active, happy couple.
We decided not to have children because we already have Eric, who's a wonderful stepson and son to Barry. And we have many friends and many children in our lives.
And in their suburban town of Perrysburg, Ohio, Lynda was known for her inexhaustible energy.
I never had any health issues at all. I rarely was sick. I had recently become a runner and finished my black belt degree in karate.
And as Thanksgiving approaches that year, Lynda is especially busy. Little does she know that her life is about to spin out of control.
One morning I woke up and both eyes were hurting. It felt like someone had taken hot peppers and rubbed them in both eyes. I looked in the mirror. I've got bright red stinging blisters on both eyelids. So I made an appointment and went in to see an eye doctor. And he looked very carefully at my eyes, and he said there's something called blepharitis.
Blepharitis is an inflammation of the eyelids caused by abnormalities in the oil glands. While the condition often recurs for unknown reasons, it can be treated.
The doctor gave me a prescription for a cream to put on my eye. I used the ointment on my eyelids for about a week, and my eyelids were fine. I thought I was just going to have to deal with it the best I could. And sure enough, it kept coming and going. It was as if somebody had punched me in the eye. I attempted to wear sunglasses to sort of hide.
But over the next 2 months, Lynda is horrified to see that the strange inflammation is beginning to spread.
Not just my eyelids were swollen and red, my whole face was swollen. My face was really hot. I felt like I'd been exposed to the sun for way too long. I decided that I should go see a dermatologist. He wanted to do a biopsy of my eyelid because that is where things started, and he said, we need to do it right now. So he turned to his nurse and said, scalpel, please. And he actually cut into my eyelid and took a little piece of my eyelid and then sutured it.
She was nervous, but she was also hopeful that the doctors would find out something.
The dermatologist called me saying that it was dermatitis.
Dermatitis is a catch-all term for any inflammation of the skin, characterized by redness, swelling, and itchiness.
The doctor said there was no treatment for this. Barry and I were both really sure that this was not exactly a diagnosis.
Then, a week later, her condition suddenly takes a nosedive.
I had hives everywhere. It felt like I had ants crawling under my skin and that the ants were on fire. Hives are a very common reaction as an allergy. I scheduled an appointment with an allergist. They tested for every substance that people normally react to. After they did the skin test, they came back in to read the results. I had not a single allergy, according to them. I was totally stunned. We had looked at everything we could possibly think of. I was back to square one.
Over the next 4 months, there's no escape from the relentless outbreaks. Overwhelmed by it all, Lynda bravely gets through each one. Still, she has no idea what's about to hit her.
I woke up and I was totally on fire underneath my skin. Everything hurt, everything itched, everything was not right. I panicked. It was a very claustrophobic feeling. I was really struggling for breath. I felt like somebody was suffocating me with a pillow. I thought that I was going to die.
Over the last 6 months, Lynda Fox has suffered from mysterious episodes of painful hives that seem to defy diagnosis. Now, she's been hit by her worst outbreak ever. She can't breathe, and her husband is rushing her to the nearest ER.
I could tell by the nurse's reaction that I was in trouble. And when the emergency room doctor came in, he told me that I was in anaphylactic shock.
Anaphylactic shock is an allergic reaction in which blood pressure drops and air passages become constricted. If not treated immediately, patients most often suffocate and die.
They gave me antihistamines and steroids. When they hooked me up, I felt like there's liquid ice going through me. It was such a huge relief. I was able to catch my breath again.
Once Lynda is stabilized, the ER doctor performs a thorough exam and takes a detailed history.
I was diagnosed with idiopathic urticaria hives.
Idiopathic urticaria is the medical term for hives that recur but have no known cause.
We wanted to know what exactly our options were, how we could prevent this, how we could deal with it. The doctor was explaining that this was going to be something that I was going to have to live with. He gave me a prescription for oral steroids so that when I was going into anaphylactic shock, I could rely on that. I was scared. I was in tears. I was looking for some sort of answer and comfort, and this was not doing it for me.
What you're looking forward to is a lifetime of dealing with these symptoms. It's very frustrating because you never want to see a loved one with a problem that defied solving.
Turns out I was on the oral steroids much more than I wanted to be. I was ending up in anaphylactic shock every 2 weeks. Physically, I looked like I had been boxing and I lost a few rounds. I literally looked like a monster.
When you're swollen and red and reacting and teaching teenagers, well, teenagers notice everything.
I was very nervous that her breakouts were contagious.
Day in and day out, Lynda is forced to endure the terrifying episodes and uncomfortable stares.
Emotionally, I was exhausted. I was not sleeping very well because I was still worried that I would go into anaphylactic shock. I was really struggling. I didn't see a way out. At this point, I'd been through so many things and so many tests that I thought for sure, if this happens again and I get the hives so badly that I go into anaphylactic shock, this is going to be the end. I can't imagine pulling through it again. I needed an answer. Barry and I decided to document everything that was happening.
Well, I'm kind of a spreadsheet geek, and so I made up sheets that covered a week, Monday through following Sunday.
When I was inflamed and red and swollen and itchy, I would just take a picture of myself, thinking when I go to the doctor, I'll be able to show him or her exactly what was happening.
She wrote down times, dates, amounts, everything she could think of.
After 2 months of journaling or so, we were sitting looking at my charts, and we saw that my symptoms were worse twice a month. From what we could tell, the pattern of the hives and everything, the whole reaction, stemmed from my menstrual cycle.
Certain that they're on to something, Lynda schedules an appointment with her gynecologist, Dr. Frances Webb Smith.
When I first saw Lynda, I was very shocked by her appearance. It was very clear that she was reacting to something quite serious.
I showed her my journals, laid everything out.
I have to admit, I've never heard of a patient experiencing symptoms that correlated with her menstrual cycle like this before. My hunch was to give Lynda extra hormones to see how her body would respond.
And she said, I have a patch that I could put onto you on your arm. And if that indeed is the problem, you should suffer a reaction.
Lynda agrees to the experiment, knowing that any reaction to the patch will confirm Dr. Webb Smith's hunch.
We decided that we would try this test on the weekend so that she would be able to be home with her husband.
I was scared, but I thought, well, if that's going to give me an answer, then I'll do it.
We also gave her steroids in the event that she had a severe reaction, that she could take something to treat herself right away.
I put the patch on in the afternoon, and I said to Barry, check on me, make sure I'm okay. I was really scared to go into anaphylactic shock. But at the same time, if that was going to prove to be the diagnosis, then it would be worth it.
Over the last year, Lynda Fox has been suffering from hives so severe they regularly send her into anaphylactic shock, nearly killing her. Now her gynecologist thinks she may know what's behind the harrowing attacks. But to confirm her theory, she needs to trigger one more dangerous episode, this time with a hormone patch.
It was 10 or 15 minutes after she had put the patch on, and it was obvious to me immediately that she was in distress.
I was panicked because I was going into anaphylactic shock.
And at that point, it looked like we had a culprit.
Based on Lynda's symptoms and her response to the patch test, Lynda was diagnosed with autoimmune progesterone dermatitis.
Autoimmune progesterone dermatitis is a very rare allergic reaction to the hormone progesterone. In a healthy individual, proteins called histamines, concentrated in the face and throat, attack foreign substances the body identifies as dangerous. But in women like Lynda, for some unknown reason, the body mistakes its own progesterone as a threat, and every time levels peak during the menstrual cycle, histamines are released, creating inflammation.
Once the production of progesterone gets into the bloodstream, it causes a histamine response. You're going to see in the skin hives and swelling. We're not sure why this manifested in Lynda when it did. We don't know what causes this disease. More research needs to be done.
My diagnosis is that I'm allergic to my own hormones. I'm allergic to myself. I thought, this is crazy. You can't be allergic to something that's already in you, can you? And then I thought, well, looking back, it sort of makes sense.
It was extremely important that Lynda and Barry documented her symptoms and her experience throughout this ordeal. It was clear that these symptoms were associated with her cycle. You could actually see the cyclic pattern of Lynda's symptoms. It was occurring twice during the month.
The progesterone kicks up in your body at two different points in a woman's cycle, at ovulation and right before your period. So it was spiking in my body, as it does in everyone's body, but I was having an allergic reaction to it.
It's now clear that Lynda's swollen eyelids were the first sign of the disorder setting in.
You see red eyes because that is where your histamines are most within the body, and the constant production of progesterone would eventually make the symptoms more severe. And the tissue responds by creating a hive. And you can see them throughout the body, on the chest, of the arms. With the severity of the symptoms, you could go into anaphylactic shock because you have inflammation now in the respiratory system.
Ultimately, if she hadn't been diagnosed, Lynda could have easily suffocated.
Anaphylactic shock can kill. People have died from bee stings from allergic responses.
I don't think that there's any doubt that had I not had this diagnosis, I would be dead.
Thankful to be alive, Lynda is now focused on what the future holds. Unfortunately, the only cure is a radical treatment, one that will shut down her production of progesterone for good.
I spoke with Lynda and her husband at length about how I felt a total hysterectomy would be the permanent solution, as her ovaries were the producers of her hormones. I feel that having the hysterectomy was the only option for Lynda not to ever experience the symptoms that she had again.
It was either I have the operation and I continue to live a normal life, or I end up twice a month not being able to breathe. So for me, the decision was obvious.
It ended up being a very easy decision because the end result was that she was going to be healthy and able to get back to her normal self.
I had the hysterectomy in July of 2008. Within, I would say, a week after the surgery, I was much different. For the first time since I had been having these reactions, I was symptom-free, and my skin was a normal color, and I was not getting swollen up. It was amazing.
After struggling to live with the debilitating condition, it's a great relief to finally have it under control. And now, Lynda can't help but wonder why it took so long to get a solid diagnosis.
Very little is known about this disease. We were able to find maybe 2 or 3 articles that had been written about this.
It's extremely rare. As a matter of fact, I think there are fewer than 50 cases that have ever been diagnosed.
I highly doubt that I'll see another patient with this diagnosis.
Today, Lynda is symptom-free and back to her old self.
Now that I'm healthy again, since my surgery, I am feeling 100% better. I have my energy back. I don't have to worry anymore. This diagnosis has made me realize you're the one who knows your body the best. You have to pay very close attention to what's going on with your body. Write down what's happening to you. Explain it in full to the doctor and work with the doctor.
Her due diligence really paid off. It was her perseverance that really get to the answer.
Lynda's doing great now. She's back to her old self. Lots of energy.
My life is fantastic today.
My wife Lynda is a truly remarkable human being. I'm a very lucky man simply because at some point she decided that she was going to spend her life with me.